whereas that voice was perfectly captured on their fourth studio album Aftermath, by 1967 it had been diluted slightly by the predominant trends of British pop. Their album Between the Buttons had less swagger than their fans had come to expect, and Richards and Jagger's songs had lost the raw energy that had elevated them to the top of their field 2 years before.
The kind of authority that those early Rolling Stones albums had was certainly missing for something like Between the Buttons. Between the Buttons is a charming record, but you don't go to the Rolling Stones for charm. There was those 12 by 5 or the Rolling Stones Now. Those records just had such heat and confidence.
Yet the music soon became the least of the Stones' worries. In February 1967, Richard's Sussex home Redlands was raided, and he and Jagger were later charged. The most notable drugs bust of the 60s made public what those in the inner circle had known for years. Richards, like many other popular musicians of the period, was dabbling with illegal substances.
I think Keith always sort of had a bit of an urge for chemical alterations. He used to nick his mum's period pills because, of course, they had codeine in.
Drugs weren't always associated with rock and roll or mainstream pop. They tended to be more associated with jazz in a very sort of covert way. I mean, although it went on, nobody actually spoke about it. But, when the Beatles kind of giggled their way through Help, high on marijuana and actually started talking about it, that's when, pop music and drugs became like Tweedledum and Tweedledee. When things got serious and people like Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, John Lennon, George Harrison actually got busted, I think that they tended to play down the glamorization of drugs, although they, continued or resumed the habit.
Before the trial had taken place, there was a rupture within the Stones. While the band was staying in Marrakesh, Brian Jones's relationship with his high-profile partner, the model Anita Pallenberg, had taken a turn for the worse. Jones had often been physically abusive to his lovers, and with Anita he made no exception. But, unbeknownst to him, Richards had his eyes on the half-Italian, half-German beauty, and a new bout of violence led her into Keith's arms. With no word to Brian, the pair left him in Morocco and absconded. One front-page rock-and-roll couple had bizarrely mutated into another.
So he caught up with us back in London, obviously, in about a week, and there's this sort of tearful scene, and he was saying, no, you're just too much of an asshole to live with. Keith and I got something going, It's just true enough. 2 kids later. But that was the final nail in the coffin with me and Brian. He'd never forgive me for that. And I don't blame him, but shit happens,
Later that year, Richards received a jail sentence for the Redlands bust, but media pressure and a more understanding judge overturned the sentence. The Stones were still in shock, however, and with Brian in decline, both psychologically and physically, the band had lost some of their focus. The next album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request, despite several highlights, was seen as a concession to the growing popularity of psychedelia, and many accused the group of simply jumping on another bandwagon.
I think they were really in a bit of a mess around the time of Satanic Majesties, not least because Brian Jones was really going off the rails. And I think the Stones felt slightly out of place in that whole Carnaby Street caftan-wearing era, because they knew it wasn't really them. It didn't really answer particularly to what Keith Richards was about. Keith Richards was not George Harrison. He was really still wedded to a notion of music as black, rooted and intense and soulful. He was not interested in beads and bells.
With Brian now a liability, it was up to Richards to take the reins of the band and refashion it on his own terms.
Keith was buying records which, by his own admission, he never really had time to listen to. And then come sort of 67, the Stones were finally able to take a little bit of time off, get off the treadmill. And Richards has said that he actually unpacked a lot of these records he'd bought and started, absorbing himself in American music again. He started studying it again, in a way, and I think that, coupled with the way the Stones had been scapegoated and vilified by the British establishment with the whole Redlands bust, it kind of focused him again.
Keith was starting to hunt for other sounds away from conventional guitar things he'd been playing for a number of years, and he started to stretch with open tunings. And this is really the key to his mature style, what we would call his mature style, in the 70s onward. We found him using the guitar as a big drum tuned to different tunings. And it really began in that period around Beggar's Banquet with tunes like Street Fightin' Man and more significantly Jumpin' Jack Flash, which became one of their biggest hits and one of the most identifiable Stones tunes, largely because of the way he finally starts treating the guitar as a big orchestra with that open tuning. And really, again, the whole idea is simple bars, meaning you wouldn't have to re-finger notes. You simply put your hand down and it's a chord with one finger. And he uses this, exploits this whole idea to great measure in Jumpin' Jack Flash. If you look at just the first opening few chords,
Jumpin' Jack Flash was the turning point, and I think that was the point at which Keith really started to take over the sound of the band, because he'd now got his confidence, right, and he realised that he'd done something a bit special.
Just the fact that he decided to kind of, experiment with recording the guitar that quite sort of punky lo-fi way is sort of such a rejection of the over orchestrated aspects of Satanic Majesties, and it's just almost like saying we're a punk rock band.
When Jumpin' Jack Flash came out, it was like, somebody just kind of went and just kind of blew the fog away. It was just like, I remember a friend of mine, we were kids, it just kind of come up to me and just said, God, have you heard the new Stones single? It sounds like Chuck Berry. That was a good thing. That was a sense of, the Stones kind of getting back to what they did best.
Jumping Jack Flash had re-established the Stones as one of the greatest bands in popular music, and the subsequent album, Beggar's Banquet, proved that Richards' new focus had recaptured the early vitality that they had been missing over the last 2 years. Performing numerous roles across its 10 tracks, including his most prominent vocals so far on the song Salt of the Earth, and steering the sound along with producer Jimmy Miller, Richards had truly come into his own.
He'd been staying up all night mixing albums, but back in 64, 65, it's just a thing he could do, stay awake for long periods of time, and then he found with the aid of certain things he could stay up even longer. And this benefited him in the studio, because he was a big one for overdubbing and experimenting. Once he got the hang of the studio and the fact that he could afford to not go on tour and just sit in the studio for 2 weeks doing one song, that was, he was happy as a pig in shit, basically.
By Beggar's Banquet, I think Keith had very much emerged as not so much the leader as a musical director. Anita Pallenberg, when she first met Keith, she soon came to realise that whoever was in with Keith had the power. Keith was very much the sort of eminence grise of the Rolling Stones. Or in fact, by then, he was less of an eminence grise because he actually, sang a verse on his own, although that actually goes back as far as Between the Buttons on a track called Connection, where Keith's voice is actually louder than Mick's. It was a virtual duet. As far as his part in the Stones was concerned, I think that from, the late 60s into the early 70s, he was definitely firing on all cylinders. And, I think that the idea of the Stones without him at that time would have been unthinkable.
One of the great things about the Beatles was that McCartney had this sweet voice, Lennon had this slightly raspier voice. A little bit later on, George Harrison starts singing. We won't go into Ringo and Octopus's Garden, but they had different voices that they could bring to the table. Great vocalist that Jagger is. You know, variety is the spice of life, and I think it took some coaxing to persuade Keith that he could sing. But, you know, on the right song, his voice is incredibly effective.
The band had regained their strength, but with an American tour planned, the future of Brian Jones was uncertain. Hardly featuring on Beggar's Banquet, he was musically a spent force, and his inability to deal with the drugs rushing daily through his system could no longer be tolerated by his bandmates. Having lost his girlfriend and his group to Richards, his days at the head of the Stones table were now going to be officially over.
It's no secret that Brian and Keith never got along. They never did. But with me, Keith sometimes used to say, look, he's in trouble, you better go and help him. You better get him out of trouble or look after him, keep your eye on him. Well, to me, that's not being hard, that's being, like, nice about it, you know. But unfortunately, Brian, he got in such a state, he just couldn't get it together, he couldn't hack it. He just could not do it. He fell apart. But I had a lot of respect for Keith.
It was very important to us, the fact that we were going to go back out on the road behind a new record, that we resolved this thing with Brian. So Mick and I had to go down and sort of tell Brian virtually, like, hey, Cock, you're fired. Yeah, the fact that he was expecting it made it kind of easier, I guess, you know, that he wasn't surprised, and I didn't really even think he took it all in. He was already up in the stratosphere, you know, it was kind of like, hey, yeah, but there was no serious way that we can consider going on the road with Brian.
Jones was replaced by young guitarist Mick Taylor, and the band resumed work on their next album. Yet only a month after firing him, Brian Jones was found dead in his swimming pool.
I was at Olympic Studios the night that death happened, and Tom Keylock, who was their minder, appeared about 2 o'clock in the morning, and the word went round the studio that something had happened down at the farm and that he died in the swimming pool. And at first I wasn't being told about it. I was in the control room looking out into the studio, and I could see these little groups quite seriously talking together, and Charlie came in at one point quite tearful, and Marianne was there and she was very tearful. Keith came up to me and said, you don't report this. You don't say anything to anybody until we've told the family. Right, and it's going to take at least a couple of days. So I said, of course not. Promise. And I didn't. But I had the scoop of a lifetime, because I was the first journalist to know about it, 1 hour after he died. But you don't break a promise to Keith.
Nobody was really that surprised, too. There are people, I mean, I'm sure that everybody's got those feelings about certain people. Everybody knows people that you just have that feeling about they're not going to be 70 years old ever, you know. Not everybody makes it, you know.
The death didn't faze the Stones, however, and they pressed forward with the new album. The musical scene in 1969 was changing, and American groups like the Byrds and the Band were bringing country music back to the mainstream. One of the key figures in this country revival was Graham Parsons, who had formed one of the first country rock bands, the International Submarine Band, and was now the leader of a new outfit, the Flying Burrito Brothers. He had met Keith in 1968, and the two had become very close. Whereas Keith was well versed in blues and rock and roll, Graham had an encyclopedic knowledge of country, and over the following few years his influence would be heard prominently in the Stones' output.
I started to find out his incredible knowledge of music, country music specifically. You know, since we were obviously, we hooked right away as friends. The next thing being musicians, that we started to find out about what we knew about music, what we liked.
There's no barriers here with Keith, and country music was a basic music from America's past, just the same as the blues was. And, you know, Graham Parsons played him some really good examples, and obviously Graham Parsons was a completely unique, soulful performer, and Keith picked up on that. The two were great mates and taught him a lot. But then Keith taught Graham about rock and roll, so there was like a cultural exchange. I mean, Graham Parsons was horrifying the country diehards with his rock and roll. Though the rednecks hated that, and I mean, just the same as probably some Stones fans thought, what are they doing with country honk.
I don't think that country people like this stuff very much at all at the beginning, but then then what happens in country music is that basically Nashville is the conservative wing of American popular music. So now what you have what's the great repository of AOR musicians? Nashville. There's all these people walk into the studio who plays the same kind of stuff that the Rolling Stones would have played 30 or 40 years ago and do it real well. They've listened to the Rolling Stones. They're all Rolling Stones fans. And they're all Keith Richards fans, I'm sure.
Despite this new country flavour, on the Stones' next album, Let It Bleed, Richards continued to push his new musical vision forward. And although influences were being drawn from a variety of areas, the Stones' sound was totally unique.
I mean, I think that Keith was creating something new. He was just foregrounding the guitar. The guitar came first, and the grooves and the fills and the vocal lines worked around the guitar riffs. It was new because it was more assertive. No one had really ever played rhythm guitar like that before. You'd had a rhythm guitar and you'd had lead guitar, but you hadn't really had rhythm guitar sort of played as lead. I mean, that's one of the points about the Stones, is that, the rhythm guitar is, in a sense, the lead guitar instrument. And the lead guitarists that have worked alongside Keith have, in a sense, been more marginal or just complementary. I mean, you think of something like Monkey Man on Let It Bleed. That's one of the most sort of foregrounded rhythm riffs in the history of the electric guitar. It's a riff played almost as a lead melodic line. And so I don't think anyone had ever really done that before.
The album showed that Jumpin' Jack Flash and Beggar's Banquet weren't a one-off. It showed that the Stones had staying power and they could sustain it. And in fact, they were getting better and better. And they were in their pomp.
Despite this rise to prominence, the year 1969 ended very badly for the band. The final show of their North American tour at the Altamont Speedway was a large free concert that should have seen in the coming decade. But the disastrous use of the Hells Angels as security led to a night of violence in which one fan was murdered.
Keith, I mean, he'd got there the night before. It started off good for him. I mean, he always says, yeah, I had a great time. He took some acid up on the hill with his little gang of people he was with. He hung out with the kids. He got in the mood, and when this all happened, Keith was on another planet, basically. He'd been up a couple of days. He was keeping going, various things fighting in his body, but he was in a really good mood. But he was also in a mood not to be messed with, and I don't think it probably occurred to him there were 300,000 people out there. He probably just saw the nearest biker, which is why Keith comes across as the only one who stood up and said, tell those cats to stop it.
Every other scene has been cool. Look, Cat, that guy there, if he doesn't stop it, man. Listen, either those cats call it, man, or we don't play. Come on.
He won't really be drawn to talk about it. He'll go sort of like, oh yeah, that was a bit unfortunate, wasn't it? He doesn't think it's anyone's business to know what he thinks. And he doesn't talk about it, really. I mean, he, as far as he was concerned, he did the gig. It was another gig, and someone got killed.
The following year, the Stones retreated from the limelight to begin work on a new record. Altamont had been a disaster, yet as a band they were more focused than ever, and they began to get their affairs in order. They started by severing their ties with both manager Alan Klein and Decca Records. But their most dramatic move related to their finances was the decision to leave England and go into tax exile in France. Shortly before the release of their first album on the newly formed label, Rolling Stones Records, they played a succession of shows in their homeland entitled the Goodbye Great Britain Tour. Rolling Stone magazine's Robert Greenfield was fortunate enough to join them for these gigs.
Somehow Andrew Bailey, who was the editor of Rolling Stone in London, we persuaded them to let me go on tour. And I spent 10 days with them. most of them didn't know who I was or what I was doing. They assumed I was some roadie who they hadn't met, or I was the guy who was going to, you know, tune the drums or something. They were playing all the music from Sticky Fingers. The album wasn't out yet, and they were phenomenal. I had not been a great Stones fan. I knew them, you know, grew up with them as everybody did in America in that era. But having seen a lot of bands and a lot of acts to that point in time, I had never seen anyone that great night after night. They were just fabulous.
Although their stage show was being unanimously praised in the music press, behind the scenes, Richards was beginning to show the signs of a serious addiction to drugs. In his position at the heart of the Stones' new incarnation, his professional behavior on tour had also altered.
Keith had begun to assume the Brian role. I should say that during the English tour, he never showed up on time for a single gig. And as I said, it was very casual travel. You just got on a train with these guys. Everybody sat in the compartment together, and Charlie Watts and, you know, Bill Wyman and Jagger. Nobody was special. Sometimes they took a bus. They had a chartered bus. But you know, Keith never traveled with anybody else. I never saw him on any means of conveyance in London. He would appear at the gig with Anita, their very young son Marlon, Graham Parsons, ex-Bird, ex-Burrito brother, great friend and fan of Keith's. And this speaks to the innocence of the world back then. I had no idea that they were stoned on heroin. I had no idea. I knew they were in a different place than I was, you know. But the Stones were so practiced at deception. They had lived in the public eye at that point for 7 years. They'd had like 35 singles and 14 albums. Many of the singles had been #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. They had grown up in the world of pop music, the early 60s, and they were very clever at hiding in plain sight what it was they were actually doing. They were geniuses at this, okay? And the only people who ever saw them use heroin at that point in time were also using heroin.
After the tour, Richards and the Stones left England for France, and their avoidance of income tax seemed to further strengthen their outlaw appeal.
Every time I spoke to Keith in the 80s, he would go on about how miserable it was being a tax exile. But basically, at that point, they had no choice. I think the government were taking like 90 quid out of every 100 they earned or something. It really was crippling, and they were advised by their new business people that it might be good to go and live abroad. And this didn't sit well with most of the band. It didn't sit well with Keith. He became a nomad. I said to him about, 1983, you know, so where are you living now? And he went, nowhere.
Somehow, they managed to turn going into tax exile into a great plus. You know, they're running away to stop paying tax. It's not very romantic, it's not very rebellious, and yet they managed to put a spin on it, which was, you know, they were outlaws from the British government who were trying to take all their money. Much better to spend our money on drugs and loose women than to give it to the British government to spend on nuclear weapons, was kind of the spin that was put on it. So going into tax exile and, you know, taking this chateau in the south of France and so on, very, very cleverly was made to enhance their reputations, and Keith's reputation in particular, as the ultimate rock and roll rebel, when really it was nothing of the sort.
In April 1971, Sticky Fingers was released. Although it was regarded in some quarters as a lesser work than the previous two albums, it showed that the band were beating a hasty retreat from 60s idealism and moving towards a more hedonistic philosophy.
On Sticky Fingers, you know, there's an element of the Stones restoring certain things that had been kind of edited out of the emotional palette. You know, violence, anger, exhaustion, you know, drugs just to make you feel good and get you to the next day, not to show you heaven, you know, sex just to get you off, not to establish the truest, deepest, most meaningful connection with another person. I mean, the Stones are like, there was a kind of element of like, come on, so like flesh and blood here, and we're not gonna stand for a lot of these, just kind of all this pithal, it's like there's a kind of force to it, and that's what comes through in that music, and it's to listen to that record, it's kind of exhausting. Those records are demanding in a way, because all of the struggle of that time, I think, comes through on a very personal level.
The standout track on the album was Brown Sugar, on which Keith once again proved that he had a seemingly endless supply of killer riffs.